Welcome everybody to the panel by Teaching Palestine called Whose Narratives, Whose Classrooms, Teaching Palestine and Gender and Sexual Justice in the Age of Corporatized Pandemic. My name is Jamila Ghaddar and I'm honored to be the chair today for this distinguished panel of scholars and activists who are raising critical voices on Palestine at this time. This is I'd like to begin though by acknowledging that I am coming to you all from the land of the Haudenosaunee and the Mississauga, the land of the dish with one spoon, wampum belt known as the Gonaniganina in the Anishinaabeg language, but in English it's known as Hamilton, Ontario, Canada. I'd like to also acknowledge the historic land claims and land defense that has taken place just a few minutes away from where I'm speaking today at the Six Nations at the Grand River Reserve. That's the reserve of the Haudenosaunee Nation and Confederacy. It's an ongoing land defense effort, a land reclamation effort, of course, at great cost and with great courage and principle that the Haudenosaunee continue to wage that. Of course, across Turtle Island, across Canada and North America and beyond, Indigenous Native peoples are standing firm in defense of their rights and their principles, including, of course, in Palestine, the topic of our conversation today. And I'd like to add to that a bit about the panel, which is co-organized. Our panel today by Dr. Rabab Abdelhadi, the director of the Arab and Muslim Ethnicities and Diaspora Studies program at SFSU, as well as Dr. Tomomi Kinukawa, faculty lecturer at the Women and Gender Studies department at SFSU, as well as and Salim Shihade, PhD candidate in anthropology at UCLA. Our panel today pushes back and historicizes and contextualizes the ongoing silencing and repression of critical voices on Palestine within our classrooms, our universities, and within broader social spaces and institutions. In fall 22, in particular, the big technology giants Zoom, Facebook, and YouTube shut down a virtual open classroom that was hosted by SFSU's Arab and Muslim Ethnicities and Diaspora Studies program, as well as the Women and Gender Studies department, due to Zionist pressure and with university collusion, as is often the case. The panel, again today, historicizes and contextualizes these all too common McCarthyist-style tactics of sneering, bullying, and silencing critical student and faculty voices from SFSU to UNC and from Bristol University to McGill and Toronto. Participants will shed light on how Islamophobia, Orientalism, colonialism, and neoliberalism underpin the Zionist campaign to exceptionalize Palestine. And as the panel will show, when we bring all these experiences of oppression together and compare them, what emerges clearly is that these are not isolated incidents, debates, or controversies, but rather a concerted campaign coordinated and funded with the Israel lobby and with this Israeli state itself, as Israel and the lobby claim the right to dictate what we can teach in our classrooms, what we can research and write about, and what we can say in public. Pushing back against this dangerous phenomenon, again, we suggest that Palestine is in the end the litmus test today for any institution, society, state, or movement that claims to uphold freedom of speech, academic freedom, and freedom of conscience. So our panelists and discussants today will share their experiences and elaborate on these important issues. It includes Dr. Rabab Abdelhadi and Dr. Tomomi Kinukawa, of course, as well as Dr. David Miller and Kylie Broderick. We'll be providing bios for everyone shortly. And we have as discussants Dr. Michelle Hartman, Sarah Abdelshamy, and Hanan Dudin. So glad to have you all with us today. and we'll be again introducing your bios one by one. But just to let you all know what to expect today, we're going to go through a couple of rounds of presentations and responses between our panelists and our discussants. And then at the end, we'll provide an opportunity for some Q&A with the audience through the chat function on Facebook and so on. So without further ado, I would like to hand it over to our first panelists, Dr. Rabab Abdelhadi and Tomomi Kinukawa. And again, you will see their bios posted in the Facebook chat. Please go ahead.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, صباح الخير, مساء الخير, مساء النور, to everybody who's with us. This is when we started Tomomi Kinukawa, and I should say that we are at an institution, San Francisco State University, that sits on the stolen indigenous lands of the Ohlone people, and that land is continues to be stolen and deprived, exactly as what we're going to talk about Palestine. Even though we're not talking about Palestine per se, we're talking about how Palestine is being silenced, narratives and speech and activism and punishment. When Tomomi Kinukawa and I put this panel, and Salim Shahada put this panel together back in February, I believe, the deadline, we did not have the two additional victims, if you will, of the Israel lobby, the neoliberalism, and the university suppression, Kylie and David with us. Now we are adding more people to have that, and we're adding more students who are, or former students who are joining us as well to speak about this. The reason we organized this panel is to discuss the specific issues, not only about the silencing and academic freedom per se, but also to talk about how all these things come together. And to remind people who are joining us, we're speaking, Tomomi Kinukawa and I, and with us Salim Shahade, we're speaking about a panel we organized, Open Classroom, in September 2020, September 23rd, 2020, to be precise, with an preliminary panel of people called Whose Narratives, Gender Justice and Resistance, a conversation with Layla Khalid. And it had Layla Khalid as one of the speakers, the Palestinian icon, feminist icon, along with several other very luminaries around the world. Ronnie Kasrils, who is an anti-Zionist Jewish activist with the Palestine Solidarity group in South Africa, and also a leader of the African National Congress and its resistance arm throughout the apartheid, the political apartheid era. We also had Sekou Odinga, who has been a long leader of the Black Liberation Movement, and who had actually joined the group of Malcolm X and resigned after Malcolm X was assassinated, and has spent 33 years in prison, in U.S. prisons, fighting for the liberation of Black people and people around the world. And we had the Laura Whitehorn, who is a queer anti-Zionist Jewish activist in New York City, who spent 14 years in prison, and also has been very much engaged in an organization called Releasing Age People in Prison, and has recently actually advocated and won the release of, most recently, David Gilbert, who's also an anti-Zionist Jewish activist who spent 40 years plus in prison, in the US prison. And then we had Rula Abu Daho, who was and continues to be the acting director of the Institute for Women's Studies at Birzeit University, along with the two of us and with Layla Khalid. And the purpose of it was to actually discuss the history, to discuss the ability, and insist that all histories should be discussed, all narratives should be discussed, that Palestinian narrative of Palestine and Palestinian resistance, as well as other revolutionary narratives, have been shut down and silenced again and again. And this is part of our objectives and our mission, both as the AMED Studies program, as well as Women and Gender Studies, and many other fields, interdisciplinary programs within the university and outside of the university, that insist that there is no separation between the knowledge we produce that is centered on justice within the university and the knowledge that is produced outside of the university, to demand the decolonization of the university, to dissolve the boundaries that have been established by the academic institutions, to keep out activists and long-term public intellectuals who have actually been mentoring and sharing their knowledge and enabling academics and scholars to be able to create the kind of knowledge that we are creating. So this was also as a way for us to be able to be accountable to our communities, the communities from whose lives we draw knowledge. This project is also, and we can speak more about it later, I'm sort of rushing through so we can get to cover as much as we can within this very short panel, if you will. This project actually is part of Teaching Palestine Pedagogical Praxis and the Indivisibility of Justice. This particular rendition of this project started sometime in 2016. As would actually say that my colleague Michelle Hartman was also one of the people with whom we actually discussed, and I will leave it maybe up to you, Michelle, to speak about the panel we organized at the Left Forum in New York on the 50th anniversary of the Israeli occupation of the West Bank and Gaza and Sinai and the Golan Heights in 1967. But it was also the 70th anniversary of the Nakba, of the Palestinian Nakba. It was the 100th anniversary of the Balfour Declaration. It was multiple anniversaries. And also we had actually a thematic conversation at Mesa that year, which had its all characteristics that we can speak about if we have time, about how does this knowledge that is produced outside of the academy gets scripted within the academy or not scripted, and by whom it is scripted, and which narratives, again, whose narratives actually get to be spoken about, who's not. We can speak about that because it was very interesting discussion, if you will. And so fast forward, we have been doing in the AMED Studies program, Arab and Muslim ethnicities and diasporas, what we call open classrooms, a project in which we open our classes to students and to community and to faculty and scholars and non-scholars, public intellectuals, people from all over the world, always coming together to discuss these issues with the intent to actually make known and make visible and engage with narratives that have been suppressed historically. AMED implements the spirit of 68, the longest U.S. student strike at San Francisco State University, led by the Black Student Union and the Third World Liberation Front, which was a very big coalition that, like the panels we did, reflect the coalition, people coming together, not necessarily on identity basis, but on the basis of justice, of creating very critical knowledge and not accepting everything that is being said, even within critical spaces and so on, and also to share this knowledge with everybody and engage together. In addition to scholarship and teaching, also the aspect of advocacy and engagement and activism, because AMED actually, as its definition, is centered on knowledge, justice knowledge production, and this is a project that has actually been approved throughout the San Francisco State University and the California State University, which is the largest public system in the United States. Unfortunately, and perhaps not accidentally, and nothing out of is random, the Israeli lobby, the Israeli lobby industry has tried to silence us again and again and again. And the webinar we had last fall, the September 23rd, upon which we started this project, this particular panel, was silenced when Zoom shut down the panel and acted upon the campaign by the Lawfare Project, which is an Israeli pro-Israeli Zionist group, whose executive director actually said online in 2016 that we're going to make the enemy pay. So you're going to see a lot of enemies here in this panel who have been victimized by this. And she said we're going to exact a heavy price for anybody who speaks about Palestine. She said there is no Palestine. She said Islamophobia does not exist, and so on. And of course, the Zionists deleted the video, but it was saved on the Electronic Intifada, and it's available there. The Lawfare Project actually proceeded to sue me and the university and many people at San Francisco State, and failed miserably when the judge dismissed with prejudice their lawsuit. That did not persuade them to stop. They've actually increased and escalated their attack. Just bullies always end up bullying more and more. So this was one big issue. The second aspect of it was the collaboration of our university that became actually corporatized, that is no longer true to the mission of 1968 and social justice, that has been using the comment of diversity, equity, and inclusion as a way to actually pass the most conservative, right-wing and corporatized policies. And the third aspect, which I'm going to, actually, I think probably my time is up, pass it on to my colleague, Dr. Tomomi Kinukawa. The third aspect of it is the ways in which not only the silencing took place by the right wing in the United States, the white supremacists, how it was very much connected to the university neoliberalism and corporatization and of course the Zionists. But also the third aspect was to actually discuss what does gender and justice mean? What does gender and sexual justice mean? How do we think about them? And on all these three levels, there was a huge campaign against us to shut us down. The webinar was canceled by Zoom. We tried to do another one in April of this past year, which called Whose Narratives, Whose Academic Freedom. Ironically, it was also shut down, and as a result of that, AMED Facebook page, we had the Facebook, it was completely taken out, the whole page by Facebook. And it's also interesting that we're actually doing this today on the International Day of Solidarity with the people of Palestine, November 29th, which is also the anniversary of the United Nations partition of Palestine, which at the time when the United Nations were actually representing only colonial powers. But it's also very interesting is that there is the ironically it was also shut down when we were talking about academic freedom. And the last point I will make, maybe I'll pass it on to my colleague Tomomi Kinukawa to speak about why did we do it under the pandemic and how we did it and what has been some of the victories we have achieved and how they have been related. And then we can, so I'll stop it here at this point. Turn it over to you, Tomomi.
So I'm Tomomi Kinukawa, and I'm a faculty lecturer in Women and Gender Studies at SFSU. And the way I got to, collaborate with Dr. Abdelhadi starting in spring 2020 when I invited Dr. Abdelhadi to my Women and Gender Studies classes. And I've been, of course, using Dr. Abdelhadi's work in my maybe in gender studies classes for a long time, and then so that was a really honor to invite her. And then then Dr. Abdelhadi not only accepted my invitation but introduced me and my students to the like AMED pedagogy, like the Teach Palestine and Open Classrooms, and so and then we did the first set of open classrooms in spring 2020, and that was a really amazing success. And then based on the success, we organized the open classrooms in for 2020, and one of them got silenced, as Dr. Abdelhadi discussed. And so I was, and so I think I also wanted to talk a little bit about like right after silencing occurred, like there has been like many of our comrades stood up, and then there has been that of like solidarity, and I mean that there have been lots of efforts to build solidarity. And so I just wanted to touch on that a little bit. And then I'd also like to talk about like what it means in like why this issue is about feminist and gender and queer justice issues as well. And so immediately after silencing of our classroom occurred, like our comrades voiced their solidarity through petitions, resolutions, statements, also like webinars, and like and also through conference panels and so forth. And like for example, US ACOB did a October 23rd event to stand in solidarity, and that involved many campuses, like including University of Hawaii and many other campuses. And also Dr. Abdelhadi and I have submitted grievances against SFSU administration for their role in silencing us. And Dr. Abdelhadi also had another grievance against SFSU's collusion with Zionist organizations to suppress AMED studies. And I'd like to add that recently we had a huge victory when the faculty hearing committee panel for Dr. Abdelhadi's grievance ruled that the San Francisco State University has inflicted harm upon Dr. Abdelhadi and myself, and that Dr. Abdelhadi's academic freedom was violated. And the panel said, this is quotation, that the university did not provide adequate support to Dr. Abdelhadi against the actions of the corporate entity, Zoom, and more importantly, against the outside organization Lawfare Project. In fact, the university's actions were in line with the recommendation of Lawfare. And so I think that's really important, and especially because the SFSU administration still continues to reject and refuses to support faculty panel's decision. And so I think it's important that we have the faculty voices against corporatized neoliberal imperial university in this grievance case. And then also more recently, alumni, students, and community leaders organized amazing, fierce, the petition campaigns and also community speak out at SFSU campus. And among them were like 68 strikers and labor leaders and also like indigenous elderly like leaders in the Bay Area spoke up and so forth. And so this was made possible because of alumni and students, their fierce leadership. But also I'd like to kind of refer back to what Dr. Abdelhadi was speaking about the AMED's presence in the Bay Area grassroots communities based on the notion of indivisibility of justice, that AMED has been reaching out to the community over decades, and through open classrooms, and so the solidarity has been built, so among anti-colonial, decolonial, feminist, queer justice movements, and so we're building our resistance based on that, and then I just want to say that, as Dr. Abdelhadi mentioned, that the Zionist organizations have attempted to kind of whitewash ethnic, queer, and women's and gender studies through alleging themselves as advocates and donors for centers and programs for diversity and equity at SFSU and also other campuses. And so through, as all of you here know, through promoting to conflate anti-Zionism, critique of Israel's structural colonialism with anti-Semitism, Zionists have been attempting to violently claim a rightful space for themselves within ethnic, queer, and feminist studies, while silencing Palestinian anti-colonial feminist and queer justice narratives and exceptionalizing and erasing Palestinian and AMED studies within those disciplines. And so, and SFSU more recently officially, sent all of us email officially stating that they are collaborating with AN, Hillel, and so forth. And so I think we need to analyze how structures of structural colonialism, Islamophobia, and also Cold War territorialization of the world, and also white supremacy, cis heteropatriarchy, all those have been institutionalized within increasingly neoliberal ethnic, queer, and women's and gender studies themselves, and how they provide contexts of collusion with Zionist imperial neoliberalization of all these disciplines. And I'd like to end with one example very briefly, that so when after the Zionists started to attack our open classroom, after we announced the open classroom, but prior to the open classroom, Foods Narratives, Gender Justice and Resistance, a conversation with Leila Khaled, there was a pressure for me to justify that the open classroom is an integral part of my women and gender studies course, focusing on women and gender in U.S. society, despite the fact that the webinar was included in the syllabus. And there was pressure to make the open classroom optional and to let students who opt not to participate in the open classroom write reflections as to why they don't want to participate in the open classroom. And I was shocked that I had to respond to this interrogation and explain why the open classroom is required for all my students. And underlying the accusation is denial of our webinar as a legitimate part of women and gender studies pedagogy, as though our class were like some kind of public performance or like attention-seeking political event or whatever. Like that doesn't, according to them, that doesn't belong to our classrooms. And so it is alarming just because there has been a lot of incisive critique of Islamophobic, Orientalist, and xenophobic imperial feminism, especially after 9/11. And but the imperial feminist allegation is repeated in this case, and so their accusation of my class is like based on the assumption that Palestinian or Arab or like non-Western women not seen as agents of feminism, and so I think it's important for us to look at how our classroom got criminalized. Needs to be like how the silencing and criminalization of our open classroom is reinforced by the imperial feminist, the imperial feminism. And so I just want to stop there.
Thank you very much for those powerful presentations, and congratulations on the historic victory with the grievance being won. That really affirms that the university had this obligation it didn't meet to the open classroom to provide that venue, and all the wonderful work you've done. And I think all your stories, as I've often thought before, really shows the decisive and frontline role that SFSU AMED plays in the fight against Zionism and for justice in the US. So it's my pleasure to turn this over now to Dr. David Miller, and you'll see the bio also in the chat. Please go ahead.
Hi, so thank you for having me. I'm beaming in from across the Atlantic in the benighted island of the United Kingdom and Ireland, which is also part of the British Isles, as we call them. I was a professor of sociology at the University of Bristol until some month ago, and as some of you will know now, I've now been sacked as a result of criticizing Zionism, essentially, and criticizing the fact that I was attacked by the Zionist movement and by representatives of the Zionist movement, very many of them actually. And so, you know, this is my tale from across the water, but I want to intersperse in my tale some reflections on Zionism itself as a phenomenon. One thing which strikes me, having been involved in an earlier talk, which we did some weeks ago, is the way in which the tenor of discussion on your side of the Atlantic is much different to the tenor of discussion in the UK, and I say that by way of praise for your side of the Atlantic, because the ability of people to talk about Zionism and Zionists and the Zionist movement in this country in as open a way as you do is much more constrained. Even to say that there is such a thing as the Zionist movement is regarded as being tantamount to possibly upsetting people, one step towards anti-Semitism. And so I find it really refreshing to hear your accounts of victimhood, yes, but also resistance. And I wanted to say something about that, my research on the Zionist movement in the context of that, what I think is a very refreshing ability to be clear about the forces that we face. Yes, of course we face concerted, coordinated, directed action by the Zionist movement. But of course we face it, as some of you have already said in this meeting, in the context of neoliberal universities, which are neoliberal in different ways in my country and your country, but it has the same effect, which is that it means that universities will collaborate with the Zionist movement when it tries to attack students as well as staff. And the universities don't understand, they don't have a way of understanding that this is a deliberate onslaught on academic freedom, on the ability of academics to discuss Zionism and the crimes of the State of Israel. And it's an attack, especially on the one hand, the left, as we saw in this country very much with the attack on the leadership of Jeremy Corbyn of the Labour Party, as you've seen, as you have seen in the US in a similar way, but also, of course, an attack on Muslims and anti-racist activism. And the extraordinary thing about it is that we have this kind of anti-racism now, which has been inflected by, influenced by, perhaps we could say, in some respects, captured by the Zionist movement, which is that anti-racism means the hurt of people who say that they are hurt. It doesn't mean structural racism. It doesn't mean the institutional processes whereby people of color, Afro-Caribbean people in this country, or Muslims are systematically discriminated against or disadvantaged. It means that Zionists are upset when we criticize Israel. And of course, that's what happened in my particular case, where I was attacked and complained about, and I used exactly those terms in a talk almost a year ago. And the people who were complaining that I'd said that I'd been attacked and complained about were the people who had attacked me and complained about me for making not very interesting anti-Zionist remarks about the role of the Zionist movement in British politics. So we have a kind of anti-racism which is inverted, so that the main form of anti-racism held to be in this country is anti-Semitism, and on the contrary, Islamophobia is not the main form of racism in this country. In fact, as someone mentioned earlier in this meeting, Islamophobia is something which doesn't really exist. It's a kind of racism which is invented by Islamic radicals. They have words like fundamentalist or Islamist, which are, of course, racist terms for political Islam. And so there's an inversion of anti-racism. And I wanted to say a couple of remarks about that and about how far that goes back in our history. And I suppose it's the collective history of the transatlantic area. There are parallels that I will probably mention, but I've been doing work recently on the history of Zionism, and there's been much publicity in this country of a BBC show called Ridley Road, which is a road in the East End of London where fascists and anti-fascists clashed in the immediate post-war period, 1944 up to round about the mid-60s. And the account that's given of this period is that we had in the UK doughty Jewish ex-servicemen coming out of the Second World War, forming anti-fascist groups to drive the fascists off the streets. And to be fair to that account, there is some truth in that. But the problem with that account is that it doesn't recognize the deep role, already existing role of Zionism in those movements back in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s. And I wanted to say a couple of words about that because I think it tracks right back to now. At the heart of anti-racist practice and policy in the UK, and I think it's been the case in the US and in some respects similarly via the mechanism of the Anti-Defamation League, which has been a very similar experience. But in the UK, it's meant that way back in 1944, 1945, up to 1948, the creation of the State of Israel, the anti-fascist groups in this country, the main anti-fascist group, the 43 group, the one which would confront the fascists physically on the streets, was also an organization which had many communists in it, but it also had a number of Zionists in it. And in fact, as I've discovered in my recent investigations, the executive of that organization actually affiliated to a particular organization in Israel in 1948. That organization was the Irgun, the armed movement of revisionist Zionism associated with Jabotinsky, and of course with the leader at that time, Menachem Begin, who went on to, of course, become the Prime Minister of Israel. Now that's an extraordinary fact, which is not widely known. It's not in the largely hagiographic historical books about the period, but nevertheless appears to be the case. 30 or so of the members of this anti-fascist group went to fight with the Irgun, not just with the Haganah, but with the Irgun in 1948 to ethnically cleanse Palestine. And some of them came back to join the anti-fascist and anti-racist movement in this country. And in 1962, they formed another organization called the 62 Group, which was again compromised by that same split. There was a left faction, yes, but there was also a Zionist faction, and that tracks right up to the present day. The same people involved, same currents, the same tendencies in the anti-racist movement today, saying the problem with that racism in this country is anti-Semitism, not racism which is structural, it's institutional, which relates to the interests of the imperial British state, in the context of course, of American imperialism. And those are things we should not pay attention to. That's why we have this. I mean, there's a long historical period and it's complicated, etc. But that's why we have this thing that anti-Semitism is the most important form of racism, and the conflation between anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism. Because the anti-fascists of 1944, 45, 46, 47, 48 went off to kill Arabs and came back and joined the anti-fascist movement in this country and in your country too. And that I think is something which we don't know well enough in our movement, and which we need to know more about. It tells us that the weakness of anti-racist politics is not just something which has miraculously come about just now as a result of the actions of the Israeli government, although of course that has been important, but it goes back some considerable way, and that's because of the influence in left politics coming out of the Second World War of Zionism, and in particular, not only revisionist Zionism. So I wanted to give that kind of some kind of historical note as a way of trying to explain some of the predicament we find ourselves in, that I find myself in, and many others have found ourselves in, that we have to face up to the long-term influence of the Zionist movement, not just in the way we talk about the Israel lobby, not just the government policy or foreign policy, but on our movements, on the anti-racist movement, on the workers' movement. That's the lesson I would want to give in terms of thinking about resistance now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Miller. And we're seeing very strongly this paradox or reality that shutting down free speech and academic freedom on Palestine and to expose the crimes of the Israeli state is both premised on racism and Orientalism, and also the goal is to reinforce and push forward racist agendas. I'm going to ask Kylie Broderick to step into the conversation, and you'll see her bio as well in the chat.
Thank you so much, Jamila, and thank you so much to the organizers and the tech team, Mariam and Samir, for actually making this possible. I want to recognize that I'm also on stolen and unceded Indigenous territory here in North Carolina, the Eno, Okanichi, and Socorro lands, and of the Saponi Nation. So today I'm giving a talk about my personal experience in facing threats to academic freedom. In August 2021, I began teaching a course on the history of Palestine and Israel as a graduate student instructor. My course kicked off amidst months of a concentrated Zionist smear campaign that sought to remove me as an instructor by intimidating me personally and pressuring the university to violate my academic freedoms, a campaign that would eventually bring in representatives of both Israel and the US. And I'm going to talk about what happened, why it happened, and then I'm going to offer some thoughts about what we can do about the wider context that produced this smear campaign. I was also hoping I could share my screen, but I didn't practice it before this, so I'm hoping this won't be. Nope, I won't be able to. In that case, I'm going to introduce the situation by first giving some context about UNC in general and why it and I became a target so quickly for Zionists. In 2019, UNC and Duke University's Joint Consortium for Middle East Studies was subjected to a Department of Education investigation for a conference it hosted called The Conflict Over Gaza, which caused a huge national controversy. While the Department of Education investigation did order the consortium to recalibrate its tone on Middle East programming because essentially, to summarize, because it was basically too positive to Muslims, essentially, and didn't contend with the historic and ongoing, as it called it, oppression of religious minorities. What it didn't give Zionists at the forefront of the campaign was ultimately what they wanted, which was for UNC to adopt the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism, which I'm sure most of us know means that it unfolds critiques of Israel under the designation of anti-Semitism. This will become relevant later. That same network of people would again activate in August of this year when I was exposed through the Hasbara outlet called Allgemeiner by a local beat reporter in Chapel Hill. You can find all of that information in a New York Times article about it. So on to my circumstances. In early August, I uploaded my finished syllabus to the students' internal website, which is called Sakai for Us. One day later, less than 12 hours later, a hit piece appeared about me on Allgemeiner, where the journalist had clearly mined my social media for anti-Israel tweets. They reiterated unrelentingly over the course of half a dozen articles published on that website that I was anti-Semitic and that the mob needed to activate in order to intimidate me. All of these claims were boosted by large-scale social media accounts like StopAntisemitism.org, which is a notorious doxer. This campaign then crossed over to more pan-cause right-wing websites like Campus Watch, and finally they crossed over to the allegedly secular media, including ABC, through their connections. But that wasn't all. The Hasbara network tried many approaches to entering my classroom. For instance, representatives of the Campus Hillel chapter also attempted to assert their right over my classroom by asking me to invite a member of the Israeli Knesset as a guest speaker. It was this same Hillel that also condemned me as anti-Semitic. All in all, the university received thousands of emails about me demanding that I be fired, and they came from all echelons of society. But honestly, what was more troubling than the mobilization of the Hasbara network was how the university wanted me to respond to their baseless accusations, which matches a lot of the experiences of other people on this panel. Early in that August, the university mostly responded through an email that UNC's chancellor sent to Allgemeiner, which asserted they had faith in me to teach this class, basically. But that email's alleged confidence in me was attenuated in the meetings I actually had with admin. They spent a good deal of time examining my ability to be objective, whatever that means. Then they wanted to issue the letter that you see that I was including in the slideshow. Sorry, hopefully I can send that later. But the letter that they wanted to send basically framed my innocence around the assertion that I am not anti-Semitic and that therefore I'm able to teach this class. But in doing so, as I told them repeatedly in these meetings, they were playing into a Zionist playbook that we cannot win. Connecting critiques of Israel to anti-Semitism will forever put us on defensive footing by forcing us to explain that wanting Palestinian history to be told shouldn't be centered around Israel's rules about who has the right to have rights and have a history. The admin also wanted me to meet with Jewish studies faculty nonsensically, in my opinion. In actual fact, both this letter they wanted to circulate and the fact they pushed me to meet with Jewish studies faculty reinforced the fact that they believed that Zionism and anti-Zionism is a primarily Jewish issue, which I expressly reject, as most of us do, I'm sure. This shows me...
Sorry to interrupt, but just so you know, you can share your slides. I'm coming to you from behind the screen, so to speak. At the bottom of your screen, there's a share. At the very bottom, there's a share button.
Oh, okay.
And I'm so sorry to all our viewers. We're just having these last-minute technical issues because this was originally supposed to be broadcast through the Middle East Studies Association, but we weren't able to get the link. So we very quickly created this backup plan. So please take your time, Kylie. I felt that it was so important. You kept mentioning the letter, so I wanted to give you the chance to post it.
Can you see it now?
Not yet.
Okay. Give me 1 second to try it again. Share screen. Share screen.
Okay, we'll just ask everyone to be patient. It'll just be a few seconds.
Yeah, sorry.
Big deal. No, it's all right. It sounds like this letter
says,
worth seeing. So
the problem is it says Chrome has lost permission to capture your screen.
So it's a follow browser.
But I am happy to pass on the slideshow later if that's helpful.
We'll post it later. Please, you know what? Go ahead and we can share it with the audience some other way later.
Okay. Sorry about that. I should have tested this before we started. But basically, the letter was an internally circulated one between admin. So the fact that they framed this letter in ways that started with me affirming the university's commitment to fighting anti-Semitism and then ending with the fact that they were asserting that I'm not anti-Semitic was framing this, as I think, as primarily a Jewish issue, the fact that Zionists were attacking me, which I don't agree with. And so I think the fact that they were willing to play in the playbook of Zionists shows me that university leaders are either illiterate or more likely deliberately cowardly when faced with Zionist smear campaigns. And so ultimately I didn't consent with this letter being issued, and it was dropped, which is why it's probably important to show it later. So the campaign went on. It was at the height of the smear campaign that I received word that the university was meeting with a representative of the Israeli government about my course, a move which, if I'm not mistaken, is unprecedented to have a very public meeting of an Israeli official. I learned later via The Intercept that the meeting was with Consul General to the Southeastern United States, Anat Sultan Dudin. According to the administrators, her prepared notes for the meeting was to accuse me of anti-Semitism in almost any way conceivable, which stopped short of directly demanding that I be removed from my position, but subtly demanded that the fact that I had to be monitored in some way. I was also told that the university was meeting with a U.S. congressional representative in North Carolina, who I later learned was Democratic House Representative Kathy Manning. Her demands were more legible to the university. She wanted to get access to my supposedly optional mid-semester evaluations that the university demanded early on, where students could anonymously evaluate my performance, and I'm sure to make sure that I wasn't intimidating anyone. In effect, she wanted access to my classroom. So moving on to when things started to turn around, which was in late September, or in the September time. The tide began definitively turning when a reporter at The Intercept got a hold of me, and it was that report that boosted it to other outlets, including Inside Higher Ed, the Daily Tar Heel, Jewish Currents, and other outlets, all of which broadcasted the ludicrousness of having representatives from 2 states attempting to intervene into one class offered, at a public university. Before that, the only attention my situation was receiving was really from Hasbara and Zionists, which meant that every day my inbox was filled with dozens of negative emails ranging from, kind of paternalistic shaming to more vitriolic hate and sometimes threats. Ultimately, at this point, there are still a couple of threats remaining, although the tides have really turned in my case so far. A state congressional member of North Carolina has issued a letter also accusing me of anti-Semitism, and a right-wing legal group has forwarded my case to the Department of Education, which might require a university response. But taking this all together, I think that studying the ways that these networks were mobilized is of vital importance. On my side, aside from the media campaign that began with The Intercept, it was grassroots organizations like the local chapter of Jewish Voices for Peace and an interfaith organization called Voices for Justice in Palestine that initiated letter writing campaigns for me to warn the university that they were watching, right? and those proved to be invaluable. Representatives from Palestine Legal and later UNC's chapter of AAUP also made public their support. My various professors in my department backed me up. But one thing that struck me was the informal and haphazard way the defense of my position was mobilized, whereas Hasbara was clearly organized and ready to use their various traditional and social media platforms to galvanize the campaign against me. They were able to dominate the airwaves quickly on this, and it caused the university to act pretty defensively. We also must recognize the way that those, as other commentators have talked about, we have to recognize the ways that those who are seeking to criminalize teaching about Palestine from a pro-Palestinian perspective or a truthful perspective are tapping into other right-wing networks and causes that are also endeavoring and succeeding in censoring free speech and academic freedom on campus, university campuses. For instance, there are many ongoing legislative processes happening across the US that have restricted teaching from the approach that they reductively and accurately called CRT, which is in actual fact an attempt to erase white supremacy from US history. Both anti-CRT and anti-BDS laws seek to punch down against the racially and ethnically minoritized people living under the aegis of the twin settler colonies of US and Israel. These cases raise the question of whose narratives are protected by academic freedom and whose classrooms are considered violatable. My case towed the line. So I wanted to move on now to talk about what this means for what we can do and what we should possibly do. And in my limited experience, I have come to believe that we need a two-pronged approach to continue to dismantle the power that Hasbara and other pro-colonial causes have historically had over universities. The first approach is an activist and organizational one, and the second one is a pedagogical one. So in the South, taking the activist part first, we have a number of unique institutional challenges that I don't think the Midwest, Northeast, and West Coast have, or at least at the same scale. One of them is the lack of unions, or at least strong ones, on public college campuses, which is a legacy of the right to work laws and the strenuous union breaking that corporations in these states have engaged in. Unions in places like New York have been essential partners in passing BDS resolutions. We don't have that capacity in the South as it stands now. And as a result, Southern SJP chapters often seem very isolated from other campaigns for racial and anti-imperialist justice. The SJP chapter at UNC, for instance, has been diminished in recent years for this reason and for the fact they're a highly visible and targeted organization with a highly vulnerable membership. This is bad news for ending university endorsements for Zionism in the place that is arguably the strongest in the evangelical South. What's more, a new survey commissioned by UNC Pembroke has found that younger evangelicals are much less supportive of Israel than older evangelicals. From 2018 to 21, this group dropped from 75% to 34%. And so to me, this shows an opportunity. University campuses are obviously key battlegrounds in advancing justice for Palestine. And so BDS campaigns on Southern campuses really need more support. And then my last point, as I wrap up, there are two hangovers in pedagogy that we really need to address in order to teach justice in the classroom. The first is the general sentiment in universities that you can't be an activist and scholar at the same time. The second is the idea that objectivity is both desirable and possible in teaching in the humanities. For the idea you can't be an activist and scholar at the same time, just in short, the universities strenuously crack down on activists by using the logic that they're less productive cogs in the departmental or university machine. And so people face a lot of professional and social stigmatization for taking on the extra work of being activists. And then the second one is the idea that objectivity is the preeminent source of truth claims in the humanities, and whether that serves our purposes, seeking both justice and truth or not. I have seen a lot of people trying to beat those who fet objectivity at their own game by countering that teaching Palestinian history from the perspectives of Palestinians is merely a matter of recentering objectivity correctly. It is objective to teach history from Palestinian eyes, they assert. While I respect this approach, I also respectfully diverge from it because I see it as a defensive one that starts from behind. In my experience, it's like trying to beat Zionist smear campaigns by arguing that, as a matter of fact, critiquing Israel is not anti-Semitic. Of course it's not. But again, I think it's defensive and plays by their own playbook, which we can't use to win. Instead, I would rather start from a relatively more offensive position, and I would argue that objectivity is neither desirable nor possible in teaching history. A decolonizing approach to teaching history does not seek to make objectivity a useful and fair approach by insisting that colonized indigenous people are capable of being objective. Instead, it argues that the concept of objectivity is a colonizer's tool, and one we must discard entirely. That's all from me today. I really appreciate the time that you've spent listening to me, and I look forward to hearing the rest of the panel. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you so much, Kylie, for that thorough presentation of this violent attack you faced. And I'm sorry about the slides, but again, we'll post them in a bit. I think just in the context of you bringing up the IHRA, I would just mention maybe some good news that recently on November 26th, the membership of the Canadian Association of University Teachers, COT, passed a resolution condemning the IHRA. So that's a nice move forward that way. And I'm gonna call on Sarah Abdelshamy now to come forward from McGill University. And again, you'll see the bio. Please go ahead, Abdelshamy, Sarah Abdelshamy.
Hi, thank you so much to the organizers for putting together the panel and for inviting me. I wanted to start by acknowledging that I am currently coming in from Tiohtià:ke, Turtle Island, which is commonly known as Montreal, Canada. I've also recently graduated from McGill University, a university that bears and honors the name of a slave owner named James McGill. And I bring up that aspect because I believe that the physical dimension almost completely removes any possibility for classrooms and universities to truly accommodate any narrative or identities that don't advance the hegemonic structure of McGill and that McGill represents. So anything outside of it, like Black solidarity work or land back or Palestine solidarity work, is treated as a hindrance to and compromises that hegemony. So what's interesting, though, is that while there is no denying that an institution like McGill itself has been and continues to be a settler colonial project, it has kind of shrouded itself in a like neoliberal image that exonerates it from this kind of scrutiny. And upon closer look, we can notice that this like liberal facade is nothing more than neo-colonial narratives that are meant to like advance Orientalist and Islamophobic rhetoric that only serve to protect an upper crust of students, faculty, and staff that are shielded by their own privileges. So whose narratives and whose classrooms is indeed a relevant and pressing questions that I have spent the majority of my time at university, as most people do, contemplating. And it's one that's inextricably linked to the fact that my universities, just like most universities in North America, operate on stolen land. So it almost doesn't matter to who the classrooms and narratives belong to, but more who it doesn't belong to. And the Palestine liberation is actually a really accurate measure of that question. Most classrooms are designed to ostracize Palestinian liberation, both explicitly and implicitly. And you can feel it like there's a superficial comment to be made about student politics, but you can feel it in the silence after you so much as say the word Palestine during a classroom discussion. And you can feel it in the tension after you correct a professor or a student who used terms like conflict instead of occupation. And it's a completely different response from when you mention any other kind of solidarity work, like, for example, when sexual violence prevention campaigns were gaining traction on campus, when after multiple assault and harassment cases came to light, at worst, we would get what Sarah Ahmed calls the feminist killjoy treatment, which is the obligatory eye roll or exacerbated sigh. But at best, we would get nods of agreement and solidarity. But that was rarely the case, if ever, with Palestine liberation. And so another recent example that I think really illuminates all of these dynamics is that of how Palestine is being treated on campus. It's the recent revelation that at McGill University, there's been a list that contains names and personal information of countless pro-Palestine students and faculty at McGill that has been circulated on campus for an unknown amount of years, possibly decades. So, when students learned about this, we obviously launched a petition and demanded that the administration address it. And despite the fact that an investigation has been launched and that 2 investigators have been hired to look into this, as well as several deans and higher administrators being aware of the list or having access to the evidence that we provide, that evidence that proves its existence, McGill has not publicly acknowledged the severity of the situation or extended any kind of support to students who are likely the target of this list. So, to be clear, the list existing isn't surprising. Anyone who has done this work knows that such a list must exist. They don't really try to hide it. When a camera flashes or whatever, it's very obvious that something's going on. But what's interesting is that Zionist students are then partaking in a certain kind of surveillance of racialized students, and it's then being treated as exceptional or ahistorical. So the surveillance of mostly racialized students and having our photos taken and our names being documented is no longer contextualized historically of the really long, the severe pattern of racialized students being surveilled and targeted by the state, by universities, by institutions. It's now seen as an exception, and it's seen as just a unique case, as opposed to a pattern of violence and of surveillance. And so it's also really interesting because Zionists are given the privilege of historical context for their libel, but Palestinians are very rarely given that context, and are usually any harassment against Palestinians or pro-Palestine is seen as the exception. And so I want to wrap up by just with a couple of questions. So first is the singularity or exceptionalism of Palestine a trend that could be documented across North America? And how are student politics and dynamics used to create intense criminalization of students that espouse pro-Palestine beliefs by rampant harassment? And how harassment is treated as a natural response to the threat that is Palestine, which naturally frames Palestine as a threat, and students who express solidarity with Palestine are seen then as threats. So yes, to wrap up, it's interesting how university campuses often now reflect a chilling replication of state surveillance, the use of scare tactics, and facilitates the harassment, bullying, and doxing of Palestinian students, and mostly racialized students who are espousing Palestinian beliefs. Thank you again.
Thank you so much, Sarah. You brought out so powerfully from your experience as a student what the Palestine exception really means. And I can certainly relate to your experience as a student organizer, particularly in terms of being doxxed, where, when I was organizing at the University of Toronto, we saw a very powerful, blatant alliance between the men's rights activists, the white supremacists, and the Zionist students. And they really particularly targeted the Arab Palestinian women organizers. And there were many instances of doxing that, particularly through the Graduate Student Union, that were not only very violent and kind of taken out of context of that larger struggle, the larger context for Palestine and in terms of Islamophobia and Orientalism, but the way it was also responded to, because it was related to Palestine, the response from the Graduate Student Union, from the university, was almost non-existent. Whereas if this doxing had happened to racialized women or other women from other struggles, people working around sexualized violence, we saw that happen on campus. The response was so strong, as in, you can't do that, that's not around. So we could see this issue of doxing, I think. I'm glad you brought that into our conversation today. It's a big deal. I'm going to ask Hanan Dudin to step into the conversation, and again, you'll see her bio in the comments. Please go ahead, Hanan.
Good afternoon, morning, everybody that is viewing us. I just want to say that I'm so honored to be among these distinguished panelists and academics that I, as a student, have been inspired by and have looked up to in the past. So thank you all for being here with us today. I'd like to mention that I am on unceded Musqueam territory, and I'd like to mention that just less than an hour, a couple of kilometers away from me, Wet'suwet'en land defenders are trying to are having their land sovereignty challenged by members of the RCMP and VPD, and and female Indigenous land defenders have been arrested on private property without warrants, and are being and have described their arrests as kidnappings. They have been withheld from their families. Information has been withheld from their families about their whereabouts. And they are being, and their families and their chiefs are being blockaded from their own land, while the RCMP and VPD have allowed permission for Coastal GasLink to continue to drill and access and create a pipeline on unceded territory without the permission of Indigenous landers, with their explicit denial of this crisis. And so I'll just give you guys a brief history of what NSJP does. National Students for Justice in Palestine formed after the Oslo Accords, which collapsed the previous student movement in North America, which was GUPS, the General Union of Palestinian Students, which was a backbone of the Palestinian Liberation Organization. And with the fall of the Palestinian Liberation Organization after the Oslo Accords, GUPS, the General Union of Palestinian Students, also somewhat fell apart. It was a revolutionary group of students fighting for Palestinian justice across university campuses in North America. And since that has happened, Students for Justice in Palestine chapters have opened up across university campuses in Canada and in the US. And so these have taken the place of GUPS in an attempt to revive the student movement. National Students for Justice in Palestine has been operating for over 10 years, holding conferences to unite these students in one place and allow them to learn from each other, to theorize, to develop liberation. What does it look like? To bring them together, to provide them access to resources. And that's what NSJP has been doing now, providing resources, connecting students with other students, connecting them with professors, connecting them with resources. The Campus Support Coalition is open for all students fighting for Palestine in North American universities, and it aims to support them in their battles against universities, against campus Zionists, etc. And I wanted to respond really quickly to what Sara said and remind you all that it's been almost a year since the McGill blacklist has occurred, and that there still remains no accountability for that incident. So thank you so much, Sara, for bringing that up. But I'd really quickly like to discuss with you an example of what has been happening to student activists and how this has affected student organizing on campuses. Recently, a couple of years back, National Students for Justice in Palestine organized their annual conference at UCLA, and several student activists were present and they did speak at this conference. And after it was held, a right-wing lawyer with ties to the Israeli government at UCLA requested the names of up to 8 student organizers that presented at this conference in an attempt to invade their privacy and in an attempt to hold them accountable for things that they said at this conference. They were asking UCLA specifically to turn over a list of the student activists that presented at this conference. And these student organizers since faced death threats, doxing, smearing, and have had their careers deterred and thrown off track severely. This went to court in September 2020, and 8 conference speakers intervened to protect the privacy and the names of these students. Thankfully, they lost, and UCLA was not required to give up these names, but this is just one small example of what students across North America have faced. Speaking very quickly about the gender and sexuality perspective that has been provided at this panel. I'd just like to say that as a student, I've been personally inspired by Dr. Rabab Abdelhadi's work, and specifically in her paper, Israeli Settler Colonialism and the Celebrating of Palestinian Death, the Normalizing of Gender and Sexual Violence. Dr. Abdelhadi speaks very briefly about the masculinization of the movement to liberate Palestine and how it has been dominated by the concept that it is men on the front lines of this liberation movement, and that women have simply been portrayed as forced to join the liberation movement, and women have been portrayed as, following in the footsteps of like an ancestral line of liberators, and have not passionately and progressively and of their own accord and of their own right been a part of this movement. And so I just want to thank Dr. Rabab for her work and for that, because it has severely affected my personal life as a student organizer, and it has changed my perspective. And I hope that the audience can also relate to these concepts and these ideas. And I would encourage them to read some of that work. Thank you. And I'll throw it back to Jamila.
Thank you very much, Hanan. I dare say I speak for all of us when I say that we've been deeply inspired by the work of Dr. Abdelhadi, for sure. And I think it's worth bringing out from some of our discussions the ways in which, as gendered and raced organizers, as Arab women and liminal people doing this kind of work, the violence we face, the violence that men face in the movement, there's a very big gendered aspect to it. And a lot of stereotypes and a lot of racist stereotypes of what men and women are in our communities and trans people. I'm just gonna ask Dr. Michelle Hartman to step into the conversation, and you'll have her bio in the comments as well.
Thank you, Jamila, and thanks really to everybody who has spoken so far. I think that anybody who's listening today feels really inspired about where we might be going if the young folks are people like Hanan and Sarah and Kylie and everybody else who's spoken today as well. We're really have some amazing people who we're working with in these kinds of issues. So thanks a lot to really everybody for this, and to Rabab, who's been a big inspiration to me from the time that I was a student a while ago. And I wanted to, I just wanted to start off also by acknowledging that I'm similarly sitting next to Sarah Abdelshamy. We're both sitting in Jojake and the unceded territory of the Ganagahaga people. And it's really important, I think, what Hanan pointed out about what's happening on the other side of what is today called Canada in Wet'suwet'en territory, because the kinds of colonial land expropriation, land theft, invasions by the RCMP, and the actual images that we're seeing, aside from the snow, look very similar to what happens with land theft, expropriation, destruction of homes, and so on in Palestine. And so, it really struck me when you were speaking, David Miller, about the comparative context. There are all kinds of things that are really different about our comparative context, and then there are certain things that are in common. But those of us who are living and working in settler colonies don't have to look very far to see that we are participating in various different ways and various different levels of collusion with a colonial project, and how we imagine ourselves and how we then work to extract ourselves from being a part of the collusion and part of the solidarity, I think is one of the things that is our challenges. And it really relates, I really also appreciated the comments of Kylie Broderick in talking about, where are the lines and how do we think about the lines between being activists and being academics? Where do they come together and how do we understand this? So I wanted to make some comments around both what people have said, because it's supposed to be one of my roles, is kind of bringing together some of the things that people have said, and also proposing a few ideas for us to keep talking about. So this panel that was organized, was supposed to be a part of the Middle East Studies Association annual conference. And this year at the conference, for anybody who's participating in that conference, on Thursday, all members will be voting on a BDS resolution at Mesa. This is a motion that has been a long time coming. A lot of the work that people who belong to the association have done has been kind of laying the ground for the vote that will come on this issue, including the panel and the roundtable discussions that Rabab and I have organized over a series of years around teaching Palestine and around other things to do with Palestine. And I wanted to maybe say that and connect it even to what Jamila brought up a few minutes ago about the CAUT motion that was passed recently against the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism, the CAUT, the Canadian Association of University Teachers. So we're seeing, I wanted to kind of spend a moment maybe today thinking about this idea of moving forward, and what it means to move forward, what it means to advance, what it means for us when we're doing this work, what we see as sort of victories, and in particular, sort of how at the same time that a lot of the things that have been happening, we have to take victories where we have them, but this idea that we're kind of moving forward, that things are getting better, that we are able to do different kinds of activism, or perhaps advance a different kind of way of talking about things. How much are they advancing? So I guess I wanted to put out there and maybe ask people if they are interested in reflecting on this a little bit. I guess I've been involved in a few kind of things related to BDS and other kinds of Palestine solidarity work lately, where within the activist or academic activist circles, people have been talking about how good the situation is, how things are different, how we can talk about things more freely, how we can do things more. Maybe I might even frame it as we've become more mainstream. I mean, today we talked about, different things related to how Palestine is still exceptionalized and Palestine is still seen on the edges, but there's a sort of certain narrative within sections of the solidarity community that would propose that we are doing better or moving forward. And I wanted to kind of throw out there the suggestion or the proposal that it's not necessarily true. So we've just heard 6 presentations of people telling us, concrete examples that this isn't necessarily true. And what I'm sort of noticing and observing is that now that as sort of we are supposedly able to talk about Palestine more, or able to talk about Palestine more freely, or able to say the word Palestine in our classrooms in a different way than maybe we were when I was a student, that at the same time that we become kind of mainstreamed, or we're able to have access to certain kinds of spaces, even within a university or elsewhere, that at the same time there is more repression, and it becomes more difficult for people doing certain kinds of work to operate. And so I was thinking about this really specifically when Tomomi was speaking and when Rabab was speaking about the way in which they organize the open classrooms. And I wanted to bring that example because I think the open classrooms are so important. And when Rabab, when you were talking about decolonization, I hear a lot of talk about decolonization. Every day somebody's telling me about decolonizing this and decolonizing that and decolonizing the university. But they're not talking about the kind of work that you're doing. They're not talking about bringing classrooms outside of the university and bringing the university outside of the classroom. Like, we're not talking about breaking down those barriers, working together, breaking down the borders, holding ourselves accountable to communities, doing the work that actually suggests that universities can be a different place and that the way that we produce knowledge can be done differently. And I see that kind of parallel really, really clearly. I see a lot of examples of people saying, oh, we have to speak about this very particular thing. It's okay to talk about Palestine. But if we talk about Palestine and we want to connect it to the colonization that's happening here or the colonization that's happening in the United States, if we want to say, actually, we're against what's happening with Wet'suwet'en because we're against what's happening in Sheikh Jarrah and vice versa, this kind of analysis is not appreciated. So that there is a kind of shutting down and a censorship of some kinds of solidarity, and then an opening for others. And so that there are different kind of streams being pitted against each other. This is an observation that I have that I think is worth us maybe talking a little bit about and speaking about, because it reproduces a colonial pattern, and I think it's very much a part of the neoliberal university. I observed this, the other example I thought to bring that I observed was when the students at McGill, the group that Sara is a part of, and other students were trying to demand some accountability for the so-called blacklist of students, professors, and other community members who supported Palestine over time, and wrote a very smart and cogent letter to the provost of the university and so on, who wrote a very dismissive response and reply. And one of the ways that the students framed their critique and their demand was through using the university's own language and rhetoric of the so-called equity, diversity, and inclusion. So bringing that critique of what is happening from the perspective of Palestinian students and other racialized and marginalized students who were in solidarity or are in solidarity with the Palestinian struggle, were completely dismissed, and the university refused to give the students who were critiquing it in this context access to those same structures. Indeed, the actual university, it's called EDI committee, refused point blank to hear this as a demand. I brought it to that committee, and they refused to hear me bringing the students' demand to that committee from the perspective of the students, but also then decided that bringing this to that committee was too divisive and not acceptable as an action for the committee to face. So at the same time that there are these certain openings that we're able to make use of and work with and so on, which, you know, feels like it's taking us forward, we also see sometimes an even harsher closing down of those possibilities. So those were some observations I have. I have other ones, but let's maybe throw it back so we have a little bit more time for all of the panelists to respond, and hopefully also get to any questions that are out there from others. So thanks very much for the opportunity.
Thank you very much, Dr. Hartman. And maybe just to add one more story from the University of Toronto, where I no longer am at this time. I've graduated finally. You know, in terms of the university collusion, the university role, we had at the Graduate Student Union years and years and years of work and sacrifice went into passing a BDS resolution, not once, not twice, but 3, 4 times, every single time, over and over again. The Zionists would force the motion back again onto the floor. And these were historic numbers we brought out. So years of complaints through the Graduate Student Union, years of threats and attacks and being doxxed. They could not get the BDS committee out. So then we had B'nai B'rith come in, put pressure on the university, and they established some arbitrary university committee that declared its jurisdiction over the independent body that is the Graduate Student Union, in order to claim that talking about BDS at the Graduate Student Union was a violation of equity, EDI, racism. It was anti-Semitic, and the response at that time was to keep the Graduate Student Union stood its ground, and the union stood its ground, and the university eventually backed down. But that happened, only last year, in the sense of very similarly to many of the situations we've heard about, where you have this outside group working with one of the students on campus and the administration to circumvent academic freedom, democratic governance in terms of faculty, in terms of students, and what have you. I'd like to throw it back to the panelists and see if people want to step into the conversation and make some comments. Perhaps I'll start with you, Dr. Rabab.
I thought we were going to do it in reverse order.
You went last. Oh, that's correct. I'm so sorry, Dr. Rabab.
I can do it, but whatever. But I thought people were prepared to maybe.
Yes, you are absolutely right.
I'm okay with that. Yeah, I'll wait. Yeah.
Okay. Okay, Kylie, did you want to step into the conversation at this point?
Just really quickly, because I think that others have probably more important ways of elaborating, but I wanted to respond to Dr. Hartman's claim that there's a complicated way that we should see victories in these circumstances. I'd say for my case, in spite of the fact that it was pretty harrowing at first, ultimately I did maintain my position as an instructor at UNC. I'm a grad student, so I don't have tenure or any kind of protective structure on top of me that they had to abide by. But it was merely by the fact that it was a very evident threat to academic freedom that that made it so that I wasn't removed. And I think that this is different than in previous time periods where being pro-Palestinian was something that was imminently removable, right? So I do consider this to be a victory. I am white, obviously. And so that has a lot to do with how I have been treated by this university, I'm sure. But I do also want to take some optimism in this. We don't have a strong BDS profile at places like UNC. We don't have a strong pro-Palestinian sort of organization here through no fault of anybody other than the fact that it is not well supported by this university at all. And yet, in spite of those obstacles, I was not removed. Even before this was boosted by outlets, I should say, like The Intercept. And so I guess I just want to take some optimism from that and some hopes for the future that organizing in this sphere in the South is something that is possible to do, and it's possible to galvanize people. And that's all I wanted to say. Thank you, everybody, for your wonderful presentations.
And David, would you like to step into the conversation?
Hey, yeah, I mean, I'd just say a couple of things. I mean, the situation here in the UK has been that there have been some victories. There's been a victory against the IHRA at University College London, and there have been some victories to some extent, for example, at Warwick, where there were a whole rash of cases taken by the Zionists and which have been, I understand, largely rebuffed. But there have been other cases too. I mean, there have been cases in Glasgow University, which is where I got my first degree, and my second degree actually, from recently, where a paper was went through peer review, was published, and then several years later had this defamatory preface added that said that the paper was itself anti-Semitic. And of course, it wasn't. And that has, as some of you will have seen, that has now been altered. The preface is still there, but the word anti-Semitic has been removed, and so there's been a victory there as a result of a campaign led in this country but supported internationally. So it's a mixed picture, and I suppose it's a mixed picture for obvious reasons. We're in the middle of a fight here. I mean, a big, huge fight, as you are. But I think the thing I would say to respond to Michelle a little bit is to say, well, you know, it also depends not just on the dynamics of what's happening in the UK or the US and the levels of struggle that we face in this historical period, but to do with what's happening in Palestine, you know, as well, the level of resistance there and the precarity of Zionism as an ideology. It's an ideology which stays afloat on muscle, on organization, on institutionalization. But that is something which is not supported by the mass of the population in this country or in the US, or indeed increasingly by the Jewish community, I mean, whose sympathies are going perhaps not fast enough, but going in the opposite direction, away from Israel. So there will come a point, you know, where this collapses. So yes, I appreciated what you said, Michelle, about the intricacies of this, but there will also come a point where this just collapses very, very quickly, and that relates partly to the ebbing away of support for Zionism in Western countries, but also the extent to which the resistance is able to mobilize in Palestine itself. That's my comment.
Thank you, Dr. Miller. Would you like to step into the conversation, Tomomi?
Sure. Just very briefly, it's been really honor to hear all this, everyone in this panel, and what I'd like to, I mean, I'm not sure if I can answer any of those important questions directly, but I'm just thinking about like the kind of like labor that goes into this movement, intellectual, emotional, physical, all sorts of labor, and I think it's powerful to hear all this testimonial of all this labor here, and then put it in the, I mean, and then make it a collective. And I think most of us, all of us, are kind of referring back to Dr. Abdelhadi and AMED, I think, as a kind of a genealogy of our work, and I think that like honoring that genealogy or that history or that that is really, I think that is most powerful, and especially like against what SFSU and Zionists try to want to describe, like what the AMED like a history of AMED is, and so I think like weaving together the narratives and testimonials here, and like honoring the labor that I think like over decades, I think, I don't know, I'm not sure how to describe it. It's just it's a, I mean, that's a testimony of injustice, and but also I think it is really powerful, and so I'm not sure if it's a victory or not, but I think like archiving it, documenting it together, I think that I really appreciated this space for all of us to be doing that. So.
Thank you very much, Dr. Tomomi. And, of course, I always am in awe of the kind of things people are bringing to make this movement possible. And at the same time, remembering always the people on the ground in Palestine and in other front lines, anti-imperialist front lines in the Arab world and elsewhere, but in Palestine, pay the price with their life. And so it's the least we can do for sure. And it's compared to that, really nothing in some ways. At the same time, Dr. Hartman, so much of your comments resonate with me about how quickly we may be to call victory, about the ways in which Palestine, there's attempt to silo us from other movements, really resonates with my experience in classrooms especially. But of course, like Dr. Miller, I'm sure none of us doubt that Palestine will be one day free. None of us doubt that victory is the end of this liberation struggle. I would like to ask Dr. Abdelhadi to step into the conversation, please.
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much. I think that what everybody said is there, and it's like, so it's uneven. First of all, there are victories, but there is also a lot of rollbacks, and also that some victories are in some places and others they're not. And I think what Dr. Hartman is speaking about is something based on very, very long time engagement with the movement, with the Palestine Solidarity Movement from way back when. I remember you when you were a student, but also when you were assistant professor at Hofstra, and so on. We worked many, many times over these things. So I think there is something about, of course, I think we should always celebrate victories, for sure. But I think also the fact that the nastiness of the attacks that are going on, the fact that David Miller was fired for no reason, just the fact that Kylie is being attacked this is ridiculous, the attacks that are going on. And at the same time, you get the support because you also have a very strong community, JVP. You have the people, the big community in North Carolina. It's just amazing that you have. But at the same time, we also know that the university has accommodated itself to the attacks by the Zionist groups with the Department of Education, which had no basis whatsoever. So that also makes things much different for what you want to do. So I think, and Tomomi spoke about the labor, so the amount of time that it actually takes to even put a panel like this today, and have to actually put it online and bring everybody together on the labor behind the scene, and not just say, okay, let's let it go and so on. That in itself is also takes a lot. So I think part of the Zionist strategy and the right wing and the white supremacists and those people who are in power and so on, big part of it is to take us out, to keep us distracted, to keep us so occupied. So they keep throwing more and more and more and more things. And I can even speak from my personal experience. Every single time I say, it's done. You see, I didn't misuse university funds. Back in 2014, I got exonerated, but then the university did 5-year audit of my international travel. 5 years after I was exonerated twice, which didn't really need to happen, because they had already, every single time you submitted travel papers, they already get audited anyway. Before they give you a penny, it gets audited again and again and again. And the auditing is also the treatment of the auditing, the treatment of their surveillance, the treatment of actually watching us is very different. And I'm saying us now. I'm not only talking about Arabs, Muslims, Palestinians, indigenous, women of color, black communities, and so on and so forth. I'm talking about anybody who's actually contesting the system and challenging the system on multiple grounds. So it's not just being pro, which I don't like to use the term pro-Palestinian, because I think, it's for justice in Palestine. It's kind of like not really pro, or because which Palestinian are you pro? Are you pro the Palestinian Authority? Certainly I'm not, and I don't think anybody on this panel is. But I think that the more we do, the more there's going to be more attacks. And I think the Zionists are definitely desperate now. And white supremacists are desperate. And the right-wingers are desperate and so on. So they're really fighting. It's kind of sort of like, for them, it's a very big battle. So the worse things get, they're going to get worse because they have to take us out. First, they have to take us out and smear us and bully and attack and do and intimidate and everything else. Secondly, they're going to try to take you out to lose your job, to use your livelihood, not to be able to work at all, but also not to be able to engage in the things that you're engaging to. And I would just give one example. This morning, I attended a presentation with Khalida Jarrar, organized by the whole Palestinian women's movement. It was amazing. The discussion was amazing, and the minute details in which she spoke about being taken to trial, being taken to interrogation, what the Israeli prison administration does, and so on. In itself, actually, she said so many new things that I consider myself a very knowledgeable person about not only Palestine, but about Palestinian women's movement, about the experiences in prison, and so on. I mean, I follow it like you always think that you know it, right? You know it all. And she added so many more things. And yet I wanted to actually spend the time after that to kind of like maybe figure out, what do I want to write about? What do I say? I can't, because we have to do this, we have to get this panel together today. And secondly, there's all these attacks at the university that actually even the courses we apply for to be able to teach all the 23 campuses at SFSU on Introduction to Arab American Finance is taken out. It's very similar to everything else. We offer a course on comparative border studies, Palestine and Mexico. Campus reform, which is a right-wing side, sends a question for public records from the university. They want to actually know, and they intimidate the College of Ethnic Studies to actually also start asking me about, I want to see your syllabus, I want to do this. But why do you need to do it? What's the academic freedom? We organized something with somebody like Layla Khalid, and I don't believe it was only Layla Khalid. I think that the problem that the Zionists had is because during that summer, we co-organized with Al-Adab, and here I will mention Rest in Peace and Power Samah Idris, who had just passed away last week. We organized two major events that we had thousands of people, organic views on. One on Black liberation and Black freedom, and one on reparation and indigeneity. And they got really very bothered with it. And then we had one the week before, we had the event organized with Layla Khalid for the open classroom. That was witnesses of the Sabra and Shatila massacre. People who actually experienced, survivors of the Sabra and Shatila massacre and so on. I believe that the Zionists got so upset that we are reaching thousands and thousands of people after the pandemic happened, so we were shut down. And after the 2 weeks before, the university actually shut down our library reservation for classrooms. So it's kind of like it happens from all parts. So I believe this is what they want. They want to make it cost a lot. So the McCarthyist tasks are very much there. So we're going to see, and I think, I always say, we're going to see worse before we see better. It doesn't mean that we do not appreciate the fact that our ranks are getting broader. We have so much support out there that is actually every single time we want to say thank you, we stop because it will take us 2 hours at least, or maybe pages and pages and pages to say thank you. But I think this is kind of like a very big issue. The other aspect of it is what the limits of the discourse. And if you just, I want to just speak about the whole question of, because I started talking about Khalida Jarran, what she said, and so on. We were wondering, what is it about Layla Khalid that is so threatening to the Zionists? Why? Having somebody like Layla Khalid speak, who's 77-year-old grandmother, speak today, might be very disarming for the Zionists when she speaks face-to-face with the students. And so they had to raise the stakes so high to make it such a big deal that not only did the Zionists basically convince Zoom to shut us down on no basis whatsoever, because there is no basis, even the most elementary academic freedom issues, they should not have had a right to veto our content of our classroom. There is nothing about material support for terrorism, even if you accept that law that was passed during the Bush administration. It was actually very problematic. There is nothing, even on that, on the very lowest end of the pendulum, it wasn't. But they had a serious problem because it is not in their interest to have, even speaking about, and you spoke about that, Hanan, about the ways in which Palestinian women are constantly constructed as needing to be saved. We don't know what's going on. We don't have any emotions. Last time we had the presentation, David, you spoke about a student who actually said that she was in tears. I mean, this is the same thing, not only that happened to me when I gave a lecture at UCLA about on Islamophobia, and the Zionist student could not actually express herself, so she started crying. Would people cry a lot, and people who have more privilege end up using crying and tears and so on. Actually, we had a meeting with our university president in August 2020 to contest how our classes are being canceled. And all of a sudden, this white woman sits down and starts crying about kind of like, and we don't know what to do, because there is a lot of people who want to jump and save the damsel in distress. And those of us who are supposed to be the bad, angry, uncivilized, combative, unprofessional women who are supposed to learn our place and shut up and not say anything whatsoever, because the more you come from marginal, you're not supposed to do that. So the more we speak, the more we are going to be attacked again and again. And I'm sitting there, I'm kind of like, what are you crying about? She's crying about, oh, we don't have a budget and so on. It's very interesting because they fired a whole lot of lecturers. They are refusing to pay our to honor the contract that the union is negotiating. And meanwhile, and they say we cannot do that because the state of California did not give us the money. Very interesting. But then we say, well, why did you then raise the university presidents' salaries by 10%? Why? Why are you rewarding them and messing up with all these lecturers who actually worked really hard during the pandemic? So there is this kind of like contradictions that keep coming on many different levels that raise the stakes of what is going on and how are we supposed, to the point that you, Kylie, you have to have the Israeli consul from Atlanta come and actually intervene with the university. I mean, seriously, we have the Israeli consulate in San Francisco joined with the Hillel, and the university president went and spoke at the rally on the same day we were canceled. I mean, the stuff is so deep. There is so much. You talk about coup and what happened with you, Jamila, at your university. And we're also thinking about our university president told the student government that passed a resolution to divest from companies that do business with Israeli occupation. Very, very scared. She said, no, I'm not going to honor this resolution. I'm not going to pass it. I'm not going to honor it. You should just sit and talk. And that speaks to what Sarah was talking about, the whole question of conflict and how the whole situation is constructed. There is a limit. But I think one of the worst parts, and I don't know how we need to do it within the movement, is that because we're gaining a lot and because our stakes are very high, we're constantly told that this is not appropriate. I remember during the lawfare lawsuit in August 2017, I said, well, Zionism, and this is also speaks to what David is saying, and then I was told that this is not talk about Zionism, don't talk about settler colonialism, nobody's going to understand. So I said to the people who were writing, the press release, give me a 5-year plan, when are we going to do it? Just tell me what we're going to do today, what we're going to do, where are we going to get there? So I think this is something that's actually there has to be a ways in which we can do all of these things. And I think the more we are actually accomplishing things and the more we're getting broader support and so on, the nastier it's going to get. And we're going to see more and more and more of this happen. So I think all of them, and if we don't build a movement and we don't have a broad movement, this is going to happen. Sorry, I took a little bit longer, but this is something I kind of like, I'm thinking about all the time. So.
I wish I could give you all the time in the world, Dr. Abdelhadi. Thank you. And I'm going to ask if any of our discussants want to step in and add some last minute comments, and at the same time, encourage the audience to post any questions in the comments. We'll try to get to whatever we have time for. Dr. Hartman, would like to go ahead?
I was just going to just very briefly echo just a little bit of what Rabab was saying. I mean, I really, the point that you make is, which is so well taken, is that one, they do try to keep us distracted. We have to fight so many more things. So in the case, like we just heard those specific examples from Rabab Abdelhadi, but so many of us have faced this. Or, the case of Kylie, who's teaching her class, then all of a sudden she has to meet this person. She has to defend herself to the Israeli government. We have so many examples of this. But then we also have the situation where people who are engaged in this kind of work tend to also be engaged in other kinds of work. So this is the example that Sarah brought up, or that Hanan brought up, right? So the people who are working on Palestine solidarity and justice in Palestine are also working on indigenous solidarity with indigenous comrades and land defense. People are working on the struggle against sexual violence on campus and so on. And so we see that there are further ways that we're kept distracted and kept busy, but that kind of work that we do in solidarity, I wanted to kind of underline it, because I think that that kind of work where we don't just keep ourselves isolated, but we work within the larger movements and other movements, can give us and the kind of struggles that we're involved in more energy. But I did want to just also say one other really short thing, which is, I'm not against, kind of celebrating the victories. We have to celebrate the victories, and we have to find the things that we do give us energy, move us forward, and that are positive, right? But we also are being controlled and disciplined and tamed in what we're allowed to say. And so that the spaces that we have to, I think, maintain a vigilance, and I think this relates to what Rabab is saying, we have to maintain a vigilance so that, Sarah and I were laughing, so that the people who cry in the meetings with us are not able to shut us down, right? Because it's hard, to keep fighting when somebody's literally crying in a meeting. It has happened to both of us recently. And so, that to not let the spaces for our resistance get controlled by the kind of corporate machine, by the neoliberal machine, by the university that wants to keep a certain kind of Palestine solidarity, which is okay because you're allowed to mourn, victims and so on, but not necessarily celebrate resistance and celebrate a resistance that's in solidarity. That point is really well taken, that it's not just about Leila Khaled, but it's about that big project of decolonizing the classroom, bringing the classroom and an open classroom to be bigger, and bringing all those people in conversation and solidarity together. So I actually also believe that Palestine will be free. I really believe it, but there's still more struggle to do.
And I just on that note, really briefly, I really do appreciate Dr. Rabab Abdelhadi's intervention, because this thing of in the example that I brought up of in any other situation, when someone is shoving a camera in your face and taking a picture of you without your consent to do God knows what with it, it's seen as harassment. But when you're either Palestinian or your picture is being taken because you're doing Palestine solidarity work, you're not seen, it's not seen as harassment. It's suddenly the person taking the picture is seen as defending themselves. And I've come to realize that when people do this, which is usually white women, right, of crying and performing this kind of tragic thing. So I've come to realize that it's not so much about making themselves a victim, but making other people a threat. And so it's like about positioning themselves as being threatened. And yes, there's like a certain consolation of like, oh my God, like, are you okay? But it's mostly about who is making you cry, and that person is seen as a threat. And then on the note of victories, so Miguel hasn't passed the BDS resolution, but like if it had, it's for sure a victory. But what does it mean to celebrate that victory on unceded territory? What does it mean to celebrate like victory that has to do with Palestine or other solidarity works when it's being celebrated in a land that is unceded indigenous territory and that like was gifted by James Miguel, who was a slave owner and owned indigenous and Africans enslaved people. So yeah, those were the comments that I had. Thank you.
Did you want to step into the conversation, Hanan?
I just wanted to briefly speak to what Dr. Michelle Hartman and Dr. Rabab were saying. And first of all, congratulate the London School of Economics for their small win of being able to remove the Israeli representation to the UK from their campus the other day in what was an Orientalist representation of this white Zionist woman being rushed out of the campus by a screaming mob of Palestinian students, by her security, in an effort to make Palestinian students on that campus, that entire shot, that entire media representation of that event was made to look as though Palestinian students are this violent entity that are attempting to remove this woman and being rushed to her car by the security group. That is in fact what Dr. Rabab and Dr. Michelle and Sara just mentioned. This is an Orientalist view. It serves to make these students look like violent members of their society. It serves to make them look angry. And we contest this and we congratulate them on their win of being able to remove that representation from their campus by their own right as students of that campus. And I'd like to remind you all very quickly that as long as campuses remain, campuses are businesses, universities are businesses, they are capitalist entities, and they will go in hand with the settler colonial state of Israel, of the United States, of Canada. As long as they are capitalist entities, they will hold and they will uphold the settler colonial state. They're two sides of the exact same coin. And that is why it is so hard to pass BDS. That is why it's so hard to make these universities divest, because as Sara said, they are built on these settler colonies, and it's so hard to. And so, if we are going to decolonize, that is our responsibility. The university and the state will never destroy itself. It will never admit to its own wrongdoings. It's something that it has to be forced by the hand of students. And so, I would encourage any students that are on any university campuses that are facing attack to refer to National Students of Justice of Palestine and to refer to our campus support coalition, which I will drop the link to in the chat, to try and get support from a wider community of resources and of students that have experienced the same backlash, and to seek help from us, because this Canary mission, this doxing, this campus coalition, all this stuff, this attempt to break us apart, we need to fight back against that, and NSJP is more than happy to support any student movement on any campus in their fight against campus Zionism. So that's all I have.
Thank you very much, Hanan. Thank you very much to all of our panelists. That's our time for today. It's been an honor to chair this distinguished panel and to facilitate this very important and timely conversation. With that, I'd like to wish everybody a good day, wish you all well, and we will continue the conversations until liberation here and in Palestine. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.